I'm Allie Richmond Bennett. I am a undergraduate student. I'm in my final semester here at Southern, an English literature studies major and a history and political science minor. Earlier the last spring, or like January, me and my professor, Dr. Michael Biafus, started applying to a grant called the McCaleb Grant through the university. The McCaleb Grant is a foundation set up by the McCaleb family. They set it up after Kenneth went through World War II and experienced the effect of war abroad. It's set up through the chart with Dr. Chad Stebbins. Basically, students usually go through abroad studies, focusing on countries like Georgia, Ukraine in the post-war. What our project focused on was something more localized, which was the first domestic grant proposed for this project in the history of the project. We chose Oklahoma and the broader US for Native American studies. The project looks at the causes of war and the peacekeeping efforts. The problem that a lot of people have with examining Native American culture and sovereignty in modern day is putting it in a self-sufficient capacity. With this project, we're able to frame it in the terms of peacekeeping and post-war conflict. And there's the link to apply for it. We focused on these subjects to frame sovereignty in a way not to blame or to push responsibility on the tribes themselves. We went through pre-contact perceptions of the museums we visited while on the trip, land rights and sovereignty, food sovereignty, that's having to do with modern takes on food practices in the US industrially versus sovereign matters with individual tribes. The Osage murders and Killers of Flower Moon, which is a movie, I believe it comes out this spring, Leonardo DiCaprio and Martin Scorsese. And then in the same area, we went through residential schools in the Osage Nation and broader Oklahoma, and kind of contrasted that, not entirely with Canadian school, but their response to it, and then recent reporting from Secretary Holland and Brian Newman. And then finally, we have some Supreme Court cases that we're going to go through. We'll get to those. They're a little bit more challenging to interpret just on their own. But first, we went through Oklahoma. We unfortunately didn't have the funding to go to the National Native American Museum, Smithsonian, but we went through the First Americans Museum, located in Oklahoma City. They had a restaurant framing not specifically Oklahoma ingredients, but a generic indigenous food palette of the North Americas. They had beautiful landscaping. They have made a cosmological clock. There's as a map. We're kind of in the far upper hand left corner. Here's some, I think this was black bean chili with some fried bread and microgreens. I had a hominy hummus with some microgreens on top as well. And then here is the cosmological clock. It captures the winter and the summer solstice. And you can see the skyline of Oklahoma City. The space acts as more of a community measure. The museum itself is contained, I believe, in that left side. And that community space is, you can see that kind of glass high rise, as well as the theater that spans out past the parking lot. I spoke to a lot of people that worked in legislation in Oklahoma City and people that were involved in the museum itself, and it's definitely acting more of a community space. rather than another museum that was visited, which was the National Cowboy and History Heritage Museum. It's broadly focused on cowboy culture and manifest destiny. They had what I understood, a collection of scalps that they no longer display. They focused on the death of Native America broadly, as well as the death of bison through colonialist move west, as well as the Trail of Tears. They did have an emphasis on Native and Indigenous art, which I really enjoyed. It really contrasted with the First Americans Museum having broadly or predominantly Native people on the board of the museum, rather than people who study and are aware of Native culture, but not directly influenced by it. This is a statue that is right in front when you walk into the lobby of the museum. It's a statue of, I believe, was meant to be the last Native American on the Trail of Tears. And there's outside. What was really special about it was kind of in the back corner of the Cowboy Museum was the emphasis on Native art. This is beadwork. We just had a bead session earlier today. This is a little bit more intricate than that. Just a ridiculous amount of bead. I don't remember the number. That was the first half of the trip I took with Dr. Bowers. The later half of the summer, I went with my father and sister begrudgingly to Pawhuska, Oklahoma, where we stayed for a week. The thing about Pawhuska, Oklahoma is sometime in 2013, 2014, Food Network personality kind of bought up the whole of downtown and created a restaurant, a deli, a cafe, and marketed it as kind of the Western frontier. The pioneer woman is who it is. What that shaped was how funds transferred through the city. It definitely gave breadth to the city that I hadn't had before as far as income. During the start of the pandemic, however, there was a food desert experienced by citizens that the Broaden family did not directly assist with, but in which the Osage Nation stepped in with received CARES Act funds and created their own sovereign farm. This is a catfish head on one of the ranches outside. This was the one that was most intact. A few of them had been picked apart by birds. There are about 20 on this long day leading up to the Drummond Ranch, which was a little scary. We're going to move into Sharp, McGirt, Castro. Sharp and McGirt were two separate court cases having to do with land sovereignty and mineral rights. Mineral rights were an introduction into theft of native land, in which the topsoil was not delivered to any tribe individually, but the mineral and the land underneath. We see a lot of complications, especially with the Osage murders, that the oil underneath the land belonged to tribes and families. Sharp and McGirt, but specifically McGirt, there was a murder between two Muskogee Creek citizens, in which the police at the original scene had misplaced crime scene. And it was about maybe half a mile down, and it was actually on Muskogee land, meaning that the murder case and the man that killed the other Creek member was actually Muskogee jurisdiction. So this sped up into higher courts and eventually landed in Supreme Court, in which the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Muskogee Nation, meaning most of eastern Oklahoma was in fact native land. Civilly, in civil court only, not as far as like taxes go. That has its own system. You can see the parts of Oklahoma that were considered civil, legislatively native land. Pawhuska is about 40 minutes west, like straight on from Bartlesville. We are in that right hand corner. This is an effect of colonization of the West that ties in with the death of the mass killing of bison. This was in the Cowboy Museum, and everyone. I had the joy of going to Woolaroc, which is about 40 minutes outside of Pawhuska, where they had a bison reserve. We did not know that there was a sign that said we could not go and see the bison. It was dusty and looked like it had been shot. But there was a mass herd of bison. Yeah, this guy came right up to our car and sat, and we rolled up our windows and waited about 30 minutes for him to leave, but he was real interested in the Toyota. This is harvest land. This is the Osage Nation sovereign farm, which they built with CARES Act funds post-pandemic. It is a large containment center. They have two large buildings, one for cooler crops, like lettuce, and then another one for warmer crops. They have peppers, tomatoes. And what is great about this kind of community building is that they host language sessions involving culinary practices. They have a farmer's market on the inside of the offices that you can visit any day. And then also they work with a butcher in Hominy, which is about 20 minutes southwest of Pawhuska, where they sell beef, pork, bison. That you can, I believe they have a local farmers market where they have harvest land and Hominy. So you can get all your groceries for the week. This is the inside. Those long tanks have raven shard, which is kind of like a beet relative, more like a lettuce, looks like a lettuce. And those filter into these tanks that are further off to the left. And those have gallons of tilapia in them. And when I walked up with my camera to the tilapia tank, I didn't know there was tilapia in it. And they let me know immediately. This is in the hotter chamber. This is one of the volunteers that work at the harvest land. And that is some of the harvest from the week before. As well as food sovereignty in Pawhuska, we also looked at residential schools. There were 3 residential schools recognized by the latest report released by the Department of the Interior, Deborah Holland and Brian Newland. In Pawhuska, there are 3 schools recognized by the United States government now since May 2022. They have started exhuming these sites. That information hasn't been made public, so that there's no interference with that. You can see the two-story school. I believe that's the boys' school. But all of these buildings for these schools are now destructed or terminally moved from public eye. This is a plaque that rests. They're like 2 stores from the Pioneer Woman Mercantile, and then that plaque is along the highway. This is from the report from the Department of the Interior. You can see Joplin is up in the right-hand corner. We have a few Quapaw schools, whose location is still not been released. And down towards that little highway is Tulsa. Pahuska, you can see, is further up to Bartlesville. We wanted to focus on the legality of residential schools as well. This ties in with McGirt and Sharp and Castro, of which recognition of residential schools and their impact on cultural sovereignty. Residential schools were broadly made to remove children from their households, from their parents. At first, after the success of the Carlisle School for Indians, a Civil War veteran worked with the US government to create a curriculum for children in which the US government would take children from their families, usually with the threat of withholding rations, from which the Native population became reliant on due to their removal from their lands from which they knew how to grow food and into kind of an Oklahoman desert. This Land is a podcast hosted by Rebecca Nagel. She's originally from Joplin, but now resides in the west or east of Tulsa. She focuses on ICWA, the Indigenous or Indian Child Welfare Act, which places children in foster homes in homes of their original tribe, effectively avoiding the reincarnation of residential schools in modern day. What this case covers is Brackeen v. Holland, which is a case of a family in Texas, which began fostering a little boy from a Navajo reservation. They were aware that they could not adopt this child when they first began. The mother remarked that she was worried that bringing a child that they could not adopt and was protected by this law would disrupt their family and the community. We see this start out in lower courts and make its way up to Texas, where they began receiving support from companies, a law firm that usually represents companies like Chevron Oil, and Amazon, and Walmart. The reason that we believe it is very obvious that this Gibson and Dunn is representing the Brackeen family in this adoption case, is that the removal of ICWA would in turns disintegrate the sovereignty that Native Americans have over their children, and an interest in Castro v. Puerta, which somewhat reversed McGirt and Sharp, would unravel that safety net that Native legal powers have been working on for the last 7 decades. The ICWA case, Brackeen v. Holland, is to be argued tomorrow in the Supreme Court. You can view that on the Supreme Court's website, and the transcript will be available later. That's all I have. Does anyone have any questions?
I'm going to move to and see if I can read if there's anybody online who has questions too. I think I moved IT to the other room.
I just had a quick question about the Cowboy and Heritage Museum. I was just wondering, after you visited the first, Americans Museum, was the sentiment different there at the Cowboy Museum? Like as far as land sovereignty and things like that? Did they really talk about that, or was it just more a display, a visual display of art, things like that?
I believe we went to the Cowboy Museum first.
Yeah.
And we were greeted by the museum collection director, who was not tied to any tribe, I believe. The representation was native, representing native in the collection. So the Darth Vader helmet was by a native artist. But the tribal connection, as well as we visited the Oklahoma Historical Society, was lacking very much so. We then went to the First American Museum, where most of the staff was Indigenous, and a lot of the art, and they had massive LED screens with testimonies from residential school survivors, living testimony rather than art on walls.
As somebody in social sciences and social work, what do you find most interesting, like the current state of the Indian Child Welfare Act, or what would you, from your research and knowledge, what would you think like a bachelor's social work student needs to know? What would you say about that?
Indigenous law is purposefully confusing. From that, Supreme Court rulings, and I mean, ICWA is very confusing, as well as McGirt, Sharp, and Castro. What legislators look at and what lawyers look at are the treaties that are unbroken from when tribes were first moved, so decades, centuries old. As far as starting, nation governments have lawyers that work on their game. I know in the Osage Nation of Pahuska, they have a legal class at the university there that you should reach out to if you're interested. But as far what I find interesting are ICWA, the introduction of Gibson and Dunn, who usually represent Walmart and Amazon and Chevron, and how that hasn't come into public eye. Because I don't, as far as I'm aware, I've never heard of a oil company working in a custody case.
Do you mind if I jump in? I actually on NPR this morning, Nina Tilkenberg did a really good story about the case. It's going to be heard tomorrow. And yeah, it seems like one of the real things about ICWA that's being argued here is the lawyers that are trying to argue against it are saying that it's based on race. And that, like, since it's based on race, it's like it violates the Constitution. And Native American tribes are trying to say it's not race, it's tribe, it's political, it's nation. And so that's like one of the real, like, where the nitty gritty legal kind of question comes down. But it seems to be that the people that are trying to absolve or take apart ICWA, they don't really care about the adopted kids, right? The law now with ICWA says that if there's a Native American child up for adoption, it should go with a Native American family. And so this law firm that usually represents oil interests and things like that jumped into the case and took it on for free. And so it seems to be like they're trying to dismantle all of Indian law and tribal sovereignty, basically, because a lot of it's based on, you know, it's a tribe, and from a tribe's perspective, they're a political organization, but these lawyers and companies are trying to say it's based on race, and so that violates the Constitution, so that breaks up all the sovereignty that's in our Constitution. And it gets, the legal questions get really complicated and just overwhelming there. But
the argument of race by those who are also interested in political and land power against those who are sovereign and in their land power is a very interesting and upsetting.
And it goes back to the question of the blood quantum, right? And that was something that's some tribes sort of use to identify members of their tribe, but it's also something that came from a little bit from the government deciding that's the way tribes need to be identified. And it's also ways to sort of split up the lands through allotment and things like that. So a lot of complicated questions again.
A lot of unwanted marriages to nullify indigenous blood. That's
Yeah.
that was a huge thing. They didn't, yeah. You know, as long as they had a Caucasian person heading those families through marriages and childbirth, they could take the land. So
I'm just like, because like to me, it speaks to more like generational historical trauma and
Mhm.
for a very vulnerable population like child welfare, but it's not really child welfare, it's more trauma.
There was, I can't remember what state, the little girl is the latter half. In which a baby girl was given up by adoption to foster care, for later adoption by a mother who was white and a father who was, I want to say Muskogee. And she had a living relative, she had a grandmother who was willing to take her, and the white foster family that had taken her into foster took on this case and won and adopted her while she had a living relative. That was in the tribe of her father.
Which goes against other federal laws about kinship care and those types of things. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and the other piece, the way ICWA ties to the residential schools, and how residential schools were developed to sort of try to destroy in Native American heritage and culture. What's the expression that the guy that started it, kill the Indian to save the man or something like that? So, you know, cut their hair and let them speak their native languages and stuff like that. And so ICWA was created to sort of counteract that, and now to try and take apart ICWA again, to basically destroy sovereignty and land rights and stuff like that. The This Land podcast that she pointed out is really great,
I wrote that
especially
down, yeah.
yeah.
They cover,
The second season goes more into the ICWA flag that's
Yeah.
about to be.
they originally covered the Girton Shark as it was happening in 2019, and then in 2020. They ruled in favor of it, which was surprising because Justice Ginsburg historically did not rule with tribal sovereignty. And then Castro v. Huerta reversed to the point where it was too confusing for Oklahoma AG to follow through with McGirt and Sharp. In that civil law involving a tribal citizen and a non-tribal citizen is Oklahoma jurisdiction, so.
I have another question. Would you say in your experience, having the Food Network star has brought positive attention to sovereignty and cultural humility, or would you say that is only fed more into kind of Americanizing or you know, it's a marketing scheme? What would you say in your experience?
I would say when they first opened the Mercantile, I think in 2017, it brought a lot of business to the area. It brought tourism, which in Oklahoma, there is not much of, unless there is a concert in Oklahoma City. So there was an introduction of money, but not necessarily to the tribe, to the tribal government, to the local government.
Gotcha.
The culture that it brings, the kind of pioneer homestead, is complicated. The Drummond family, of which Bree Drummond married into her husband, has been there for about 7 generations, back to when the Osage murders took place around that time. They had relations with the local tribal people. The only histories of that are by the Drummond family, written by the Drummond family, and not entirely available to the public. There is a Drummond family history that is in the smaller cowboy museum in the town that I was not able to access at all. I don't know if it's harmful as much as it misdirects from the actual kind of nation-built sovereignty that they've really achieved in the last 2 or 3 years. I talked a lot with Jan Heyman, a representative of the tribe and the head of Harvestland. And her work on food sovereignty is appealing more so than kind of a knockoff solar Dollar City food culinary mashup.
I was gonna ask you, I know you touched on what you, both of you ate at that indigenous restaurant. Were they marketing it as like solely like, yes, this is what indigenous people ate in this area of the country, or was it kind of a?
It was very generalized. It had emphasis on like squash and
Yeah.
kind of
Okay.
generic, lots of bison, lots of fry bread. I was they've worked with the 39 tribes to create that menu and work with the tribes to kind of collect the museum. I would say something like you're talking about, where it's generic to the point of which, is the Smithsonian Cafe. The restaurant itself is very generalized, but the work that was put into it by, I talked a little bit with the head chef of when they first opened that Smithsonian Cafe. And the work that they were putting into it was very genuine, while not necessarily directly contacted with the tribes. It was something.
Yeah, I'd say at the First American Museum that they didn't represent it as the food they ate or
Yeah.
preparation Native Americans would have eaten, but more of the ingredients were like local ingredients and would have been the types of ingredients. Yeah. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the food place in Pahuska, the Osage, I forget what it was called, the harvest.
Harvestland?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do they, how much of their own stuff do they grow? Like, do they have lots of farms? I know you have the greenhouse on the inside, but do they have pasture? Do they also raise livestock, or is it mostly, do they trade with local farmers? And just wondering if you can talk about that a little more here.
They have Pahuska has a farmer's market, but they have their nation farmers market in which they work with the hominy meat plants. I know Woolaroc has its own bison population. It doesn't directly contribute to that. But there are some bison population in that area in which they contribute local to nation farmers market. The harvest land they have the 2 units, the cold and the warm veggie places. But then they have a massive field in the front and the back, which is funny because it's maybe half a mile from the mercantile. Very localized. They work a lot with recultivating kind of lost foods, things that don't necessarily like to be replanted, like the possum grape, which is very hard to harvest. It grows in like the tallest trees. You can't replant it from seed. So they are working with local people to bring their food in from their farms, and then also working to revitalize local foods from families that are willing to live with the nation. Does anyone have any final questions?
I have, I'm not quite sure how to phrase it as a question, but I learned recently that I forget the exact title. It's like the governor representative of the Queen or something in Canada. There's been a lot of backlash since she was elected because she is bilingual, which is what the requirement technically states, but she didn't learn French because she speaks, I don't remember I wouldn't even want to try to pronounce the language, but it's an indigenous language. And she has said multiple times that part of the reason she doesn't speak French is because she was in a school that was basically a step above a residential school.
Mhm.
And I just didn't know if there's still some disparity in education here as well.
So Canadian representation of First Peoples as far as our residential schools, they are a few decades ahead of us. As far as like a few years ago, there was I think they found about 500 victims at one school. And that era is so close to us. Children that were in residential schools survived throughout the 70s. I know a friend that has a grandparent that was in a residential school. That disparity in education is probably different in Canada, not something I can speak to necessarily. But the cultural impact as far as, we spoke to a woman that worked at the 5 Civilized Tribe Museum in Muskogee, at Okmulgee, Oklahoma.
Mhm.
And the backlash of residential school on her family, the initiative to practice sovereign food culture at home seemingly wasn't necessarily worth the risk of the backlash from people who are not familiar with the culture. If there are any more questions.